Thank you for having me. Namaste, Tashidele. Thank you. And thank you to Julia for organizing this and for the whole community here at RYI. I think there's some new students here. No, some people who've just started the program. Is that right? Can I know who the new students are so I can just see show of hands? Oh, that's so nice. Hi. You have a pile of students over here that may look like a pile. So these are my students from Canada, and I have my colleague here as well. They're doing a course here in Nepal with me and my colleague, Selena Lish. She's back there. So there's a lot of students here with all kinds of different backgrounds. So hopefully we can have a nice conversation together and we can just talk. As my students, they know me very well now because they've been traveling with me for the last 2 weeks. It's become a little too familiar. They've seen me in my pajamas. It's not a good thing. So they're very comfortable with me. I hope the rest of you will be comfortable with me. I hope you ask questions. I'm very informal as a lecturer. So please, if you have questions as we go along, I don't mind if you ask along the way. We can also set up time at the end for questions and discussion. Hopefully I will make this controversial enough that you guys will have a lot to debate and to discuss. I tend to go in that direction, so I'm just warning you in advance. But if you have questions of clarification or anything that you want to ask, please feel free. I don't mind at all, yeah? Okay. So my research has always been on early Pali textual material, so the earliest part of the tradition in Pali sources, and mostly stories around the Buddha's life. So I've been a fan of the Buddha's life story for a long time. And I've written a number of books as an academic, and I've written in an academic voice for a very long time, as good academics do. And then I had a midlife crisis, as many academics do. And about, somewhere along my journey, in my 40s, I decided that I'd written enough academic books. And I changed directions. And I did something different with these books that I'm going to talk about now. I decided that what I wanted to try to do, for all kinds of reasons, and we can discuss this if this is something that's of interest to you, but a big part of the reason why I switched voices and started writing more from a fiction perspective with my research is that I wanted to communicate in a way that was easier for readers to experience. And I think many of you probably have some experience of how difficult academic writing can be. And I think Julia was just talking about this distance with my students a moment ago in a different context, but there's quite a large gap that often happens between scholars and the lay community, and sometimes it's hard to understand what scholars are talking about. So for that reason, and for a whole bunch of other reasons, I thought, what if I took my research and I spoke it in a different way? And the way I decided to speak my research, it's still got, all my books have lots of endnotes and bibliography. I can't stop myself. So there's still all of that at the back of the book. But I take my research and I tell the story. And then the endnotes help you understand how I built the story, which texts I use, how I source them, so that the reader can understand the scaffolding that goes behind the book. And the reader can follow the research and also see where I've had to invent things because the research wasn't there. And so at each step of the way, the reader has all the information they need to figure out what they think of the material, but they can read it in an easier way. So it's a very different way of writing academic material. One of the questions I've struggled with this kind of writing is, on what bookshelf do I land? Do I go in the fiction section, or do I go in the academic section, or do I go into the nonfiction? I have no idea where I go. So I go in different spots all over the place. I kind of don't worry about that. I've just done something different and I'm happy with it. And it's been a really nice ride to write in such a way that I close the gap a little bit. And I tell the story from my heart, and I tell the story from my love of stories, instead of standing far away from the stories and assessing them as though they don't matter. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about a story that I think is really important, which is why I wrote this other story. It's a story that means a lot to a lot of people in the Buddhist community that will be very obvious. It's about the first Buddhist nuns and the story of how they became the first Buddhist nuns. And I didn't realize this when I first started writing this as a story instead of just studying it. But this story doesn't tend to get written out as a story. So shaping it as a story is actually you'll see what I mean as I go. The Buddha's life story, which is what I did the first book, gets told as a story all the time, right? So most of you guys have some experience of the Buddha's life story, yeah? So you know he was a prince, and then he saw the four sights, and then he ran away, right? We know the whole story. If you look at a lot of early Buddhist literature, his story, there are texts that will tell his story as a whole, but most texts will give us little fragments of his story. They tell his story in bits and pieces. We have a few classical texts that give us the whole story, but for the most part, we get bits and pieces. And if you were actually to try to collect everything that has to do with the Buddha, you would basically be touching every book that has anything to do with Buddhism, right? Because his life story is everywhere, right? Every teaching he gives, he's somewhere talking to someone about something that happened and there's a story. So what Buddhism has done is taken all of these fragments and created a story. And then we have had this tradition for the last 2,000 years of redoing that, so that every Buddhist text, every Buddhist hagiography of the Buddha's life recollects the pieces that we have of his story and tells it again. So his story has actually been told and retold thousands of times, not just by faculty members in a classroom and teachers in a temple, but in texts all over the world. People have been telling the story and retelling the story, so that we have stories of the Buddha's life that are 2,000 years old. That's about as old as it gets in Buddhism, all the way to recently, right? All the way to today. People are rewriting his story because it means something to them and people want to tell it again, because a good story is never finished, right? We always want to tell it again. And each time you tell it, you see it differently, right? There's a famous line. There's a very important Indian text that some of you guys might know. It's not Buddhist, the Mahabharata. It's a very important text in Hinduism. And that text, people say, there's one of the opening lines of the classical edition is you have to tell it over and over and over again because everything is in it, right? And whatever you need is in the Mahabharata, and whatever you don't need, just not there because it's a perfect story, right? And so the great stories are like that. Great stories have to be told over and over again because each time we tell them, we see it again. We understand it differently. We connect it to our own lives. We connect it to the tradition. We have a historical question. We realize, wait a minute, something's missing over here, right? So in the contemporary world, one of the things that we finally realized is we're missing the women's voices, or we're missing the animals' voices. Like, what did other characters see when they told this story? So we're never finished with a good story. And so I thought, I'll just tell these stories again and see what happens when I tell them. So the first book, I'm going to take you a little bit through the first of these, and then I'm going to get you to the first Buddhist nuns. You'll see they're connected. They're also kind of like sequels. The first story that I wrote was called Yasodhara and the Buddha. And in that book, I tell the story of the Buddha's life, but I tell it from Yasodhara's perspective, which is a voice that we tend to forget, right? And so Yasodhara is the Buddha's wife. I was amazed at how many people would say to me, the Buddha had a wife? And I got that sometimes from practicing Buddhists, which would really kind of make me go, oh my God, that's not good. So yes, he had a wife and he left her. As I think many of you guys know, he lived in a palace, and then he has his magical four sights. I'm just going to assume you guys are all on this page, right? Can I do that? Okay. So he has his magical four sights. He sees old age, sickness, death, and renunciation. And according to the Pali tradition, this is not the same in all the texts, right? Because we have so many stories, but according to one part of the tradition, the night he comes home from the four sights and he makes this radical decision of renunciation when he decides, I can't stay, I have to go, is the night that his wife gives birth. So she gives birth. She has produced a son. He names his son Rahula. For those of you who know what that means, it's a therapy requirement. And he leaves. And in the Pali text, in the Jataka Nidana, he actually stands at the door. He goes to see his wife. He hears that she has given birth, and he goes to see her. And she's sleeping with her newborn son in her arms. And he thinks to himself, this is one of the most beautiful lines for me, is that the text says, he thinks to himself, if I touch my son, she will wake up, and then I won't be able to leave. Which to me is the proof. I've held on to this line for a long time. I wrote a whole book because of that line. But to me, that line has always been the proof that he loved her, because he's anguished in that moment. Yeah. And so he thinks, if I touch my son, she will wake up, And then I'm assuming if she looks at him, he can't go. Either that or she's going to kill him. It's going to be one or the other. So he doesn't touch his son. And he turns around and he walks away. And that's how he becomes the Buddha. That's his renunciation story. And so he gallops off into the sunset. And then, he gets to the edge of the forest and he gets off his horse and he cuts off his hair and about to go into the forest. And his horse, this is when we're not telling the stories from animals' perspectives. This is a great moment, is that the horse doesn't want to leave his master to go alone into the forest. And so the horse is devastated and he wants to follow the Buddha into the forest. And the Buddha says, you have to go back. And in some editions, some versions of the story, because there's so many, but the one that I like is always the most dramatic. The horse dies at the gate of the forest with heartbreak. He cannot go back without the Buddha. So it gives you a sense of the drama and the emotion and the beauty that these stories can have, that they really come and get you, and that we need to keep telling them because they're really articulating something about renunciation that is so profound that it is beautiful and it's inspiring and it's awful. Because when you make a choice of renunciation, you break everyone's heart, which is what the Buddha's story is. And that's worth telling and for us to think about. So he goes off. He becomes the great hero. He achieves awakening. The whole world gets very excited. The cosmos, not just the world, right? The whole cosmos is very excited. Flowers are falling from the heavens and right, gods are singing praises and the world is trembling. Like, this is a very important cosmic event. This is not a guy who figures it out sitting under a tree and is just a bit wiser. He is a cosmic being. He is a being of extraordinary significance that the whole cosmos has to stop and recognize, awake. And there's a reason I'm emphasizing this, just wait for it. But I'm going to take you through a couple of emotions here. The whole cosmos sees a great being has arrived, right? This is not an ordinary man, according to the Buddhist tradition. We can secularize him today if we want to. That would be a new way of telling the story. But in the early texts, he's not an ordinary wise man. He is a cosmically significant, transformative being. So far, good? Any questions so far? Okay. So he achieves awakening. It's great. And he eventually starts to teach, right? People hear, oh, a Buddha has arrived. There is a Buddha in the universe, and he's offering his teachings. And so some of the men from his palace life, some of the men that knew him, they find out, oh, he has gone off. I'm not really using his personal name because it's a bit awkward, but the one who was known as the prince has now become the Buddha. Better to go with the titles in the tradition. And so he's now the Buddha and he's offering his teachings. And so the men think, well, I think I'll go follow him into the forest. That's really exciting. And so one man after another goes off into the forest and stops in front of him and asks him, can I follow you? Does anybody know what his answer is when a man asks him this question? Does anyone know? He just says one word. He says, come. That's it. That's the whole ritual. Just come. And the man sits down with him and starts to practice and is technically a monk. That was the whole ritual performance of becoming a monk in the early traditions. Hadn't developed into an institution yet. So it was just one answer, come. And you can learn with me. Yeah? So the Buddha is doing this in the forest, and one man after another is showing up at his forest door and joining him in this practice, and they're learning, and they're achieving things, and they're having these experiences in the forest. Meanwhile, in the palace, we're going to backtrack for a little bit. And this is really interesting thing that the literature does, is that if you read the early literature, you will find that not only do the early writers follow the Buddha into the forest and tell us about all of his extraordinary experiences in the forest, the early writers also take time to tell us what was happening in the palace, which is really interesting because you would think the palace has been left behind. And so the writers can leave the palace behind. They don't need it anymore, right? So if you think as a writer, right, you tell the stories that you need for your story, right? If he's left the palace and we're going to follow him, he's the point. I can forget about the palace, right? It's gone. But the early writers don't do that. The early writers will do both. They will follow the Buddha into the forest, and they also have these scenes that they create of what was happening in the palace after he left. And that too, I want you to hold that for a moment, because I think that's a really interesting thing that the early tradition does. So when we look at what's happening in the palace, we find the heartbreak. So not only do we have Kantaka, the horse, who's dead at the forest door, we find the chariot driver who went with Kantaka and followed him into the forest, returned. So he also begs, said, let me come with you into the forest and I'll protect you. And you can't be alone. You're a prince. Please let me just stay by your side. And again, the future Buddha says, no, I'm going alone. And so Chana or Chandaka, he gets different names, but he returns to the palace. According to one Sanskrit text, he returns so dejected, he looks like he's in a funeral march, right? He's so devastated to be without the Buddha. This is the sadness of the absence of this character in the literature. And so he comes back looking so sad. And the women of the palace, they see him returning and they're like, oh, the prince has returned, because they knew he had taken off. And so they thought, they were devastated, but then they see him coming back and they think, oh, the prince is back. And then they realize the prince is not with him. And then they see Chana's face that looks like a funeral. And the women start tearing at their clothes in desperation, so upset. What will we do without the prince? Meanwhile, Mahapajapati Gautami, that's her Pali name, instead of the Sanskrit, which is Mahapajapati, she's the stepmother of the Buddha. So if you don't know who this character is, how some of your faces go, Mahapajapati is a mouthful, but she was the Buddha's stepmother. The story is that when he was born, his mother, Maya, died right after she gave birth, a few days after she gave birth. And so the future Buddha, the prince, is given to Maya's sister. The king was married to both sisters. So Mahapajapati, she's a really important character for this story, so it's important you know her. She becomes the Buddha's mother. And she's going to raise the Buddha as her own, but as a stepmother and also as an aunt. So she's got multiple kind of roles to play here. And she takes care of him all his life. She's there with him at every stage as the mom, even if though she's not the biological mom. And when he leaves, there's another Sanskrit text that tells us that she cries so much that her eyes get covered with scales and she goes blind, that she can't see because of her sadness at the idea that her son is gone. And then there's Yasodhara, the wife. She's mad. She is so mad. And there's so many texts that tell us how mad she was. So one beautiful thing, the Buddha Charita is maybe the best at this. There's an entire chapter dedicated to her mad. And she goes charging into the stables where the chariot driver is, and she bangs open the doors, and her eyes are described as red with rage. And she points her finger at the chariot driver and she says, "You took him away from me. How dare you take him away from me? Didn't you tell him about me?" That's my best line. Every wife should say that at one point, right? Right? So didn't you tell him about, how could you let him go? Like, what have you done? And so she blames, and Chana is just, he's like, I'm broken. Don't blame me. I don't know what to do. Right? It's so sad. So all of this is going on in the palace while he's becoming the hero. And the literature goes back and forth between both. So the literature is not erasing the sadness. And I think that's really important to process. This is where I think Buddhist literature is so sophisticated, is that it could just make a hero and say everybody was happy and celebrated, he's the Buddha. But it's not what the literature does. The cosmos is happy that he's the Buddha. All of his future students are happy that he's the Buddha. His family wants to kill him. And the literature keeps that, which means they're willing to engage with the complexity of renunciation in a way that maybe sometimes we don't, because we're trying to be so devotional and perfect about everything. We don't allow ourselves to say some parts of this tradition are really hard. And it's right there in the story. So the women and Chana, and not Kantaka anymore because he's dead, the poor guy, but everyone's in the palace dealing with their loss. Time passes and the Buddha becomes more and more famous. And so we have this imbalance, right? We have like nirvana and samsara happening, and they're perfect reflections of each other. The Buddha eventually comes back to the palace. He does one more move that is going to make his wife mad. Does anybody know what's about to happen? Julia knows. So his father has asked him to come back before he dies so that he can see him, have darshan with him before he dies. He wants to see his son. And the problem that the poor king had was every time he sent a minister off into the forest to go get his son, do you know what? The minister was like, oh my God, you're amazing. Shaved his head and sat down. And so all the ministers end up in the forest, and the palace is empty. It has no ministers left. So finally, one minister says, listen, I have a feeling that if I go, the same thing's going to happen to me. So I'll make a deal. I'll go. I'll probably be impressed. I'll bring him back if you give me permission to then shave my head and sit down. The king says, fine. That's the only way we can get the Buddha back. So this minister, Kaludayan, goes off into the forest, speaks to the Buddha. He says, your father really wants to see you. And he brings him back. And then he becomes a monk, obviously. And so finally, the Buddha comes home. He sees his father. He gives teachings to the community. He gives teachings to everybody except Yasodhara, because she will not go see him. Everyone's excited to see the Buddha except the ex-wife. And so she stays in her room and she looks out the window and she sees him and she says, if he wants to see me, he should come and see me himself, but I'm not going to see him. That's correct. So she stays in her room and she is right. She knows her ex-husband because he comes to see her, which is a very controversial moment in the Buddha biography because he's acting like a husband and he enters her chambers, but he's a Buddha. And so there's been a lot of discussion about what do we do with this moment in the story where he seems to be acting like a husband. And that also raises a question of, even if we become renunciants, are some ties always there, even for a Buddha, right? Like, it's a really interesting problem that the story has created for us. So he goes and then he drops quite a bit of news. He says, our son has asked for his inheritance, so I'm making him a monk. And so Yasodhara in that moment loses her son. So he comes back as the conquering hero and takes his son back to the forest with him. His son, who's about 7 or 8 years old, no one agrees, but somewhere like that. And so the Buddha leaves with more men and his son, who he's going to bring to the forest. And the women are left in the palace. Everyone's gone. And then the king dies. And so now you have a house full of widows. And so Mahapajapati, this is when she becomes really important in the early tradition. She makes a decision, and the tradition doesn't tell us how quite this happened. So we have a gap here of information. But the tradition tells us that she eventually decides, if all those men get to sit down with the Buddha in the forest, well, why can't we? Which is a really courageous, unusual, or seemingly unusual question for a woman to ask herself. She didn't really have models of women doing this, so far as we know. We know that the Jains had nuns before the Buddhists did, but did she know about them? And how populous were they? And so what is the likelihood that she had seen a Jain nun? Probably very small. And so what made her think as a woman, oh, I want that too? Same thing that has made women think that question forever. And so she decides that she's going to go and ask for permission to become a nun the way the men become monks. And the best part is that if you look at the Vinaya, which is where this story shows up, there's this line that then says 500 women went with her. How'd they find out? Like, in my head, she had a thought and was just going to leave quietly in the middle of the night like the Buddha. But no, the women talked. Everybody found out. So I don't know if like her maid in her chambers found out about it and then told everybody else. I don't know how this happened, but suddenly everyone knows Mahapajapati is going to ask the Buddha for women to join him in the forest. And 500 women showed up. So in my head, I have her leaving out the door. Yasodhara hears, she goes too. So we know she goes. That's part of the tradition. And then, Mahapajapati leaves the building and finds 500 women standing there going, yeah, I'll come too, which is really extraordinary. So the tradition doesn't tell us exactly how this whole played out, but we know that she walks out and 500 women are with her. And we don't know who these 500 women are. We don't know very much. Like, we're missing a lot of details in the literature, but that's where it becomes fun to become a writer and to fill in the gaps, which is what I did. So they go off. Do you guys know what happens when they go? Who here knows the story other than some of my students? Only one in the back? That's it? Oh, you guys are going to have a hard time. Okay. So the women walk. And they walk and they walk and they go into the forest. And then Mahapajapati, I think, goes alone because I imagine anyway. It's hard now. When you write a novel, it gets very hard to separate what's in the text and what you made up. So sometimes I get confused. Did I make that up or was that in the text? But I'm trying. In the book, I separate everything. So you can check the book over what my imagination now tells me. But in my version of what happened, she walks into the forest alone. The women wait away. There's no evidence in the literature that they all go together. And so she steps forward and she presents herself to the Buddha. She sits to his right side, as the tradition requests. She circumambulates him, sits to the right side. And then she asks a question. And she says, now there's different Vinyas. As you guys know, there's about 6 different Vinyas. I think some of you might know. They all tell this story. They all tell it more or less the same way. The wording of this line has had a lot of debate because this line changes everything, but it's all pretty much the same. So there's one scholar monk who wrote, he must have written like 5 books on this. At the end of the day, so there's a lot of discussion about this one line, but at the end of the day, the question kind of lands the same way. She says, it would be well, Buddha, if women can join you in the order. And the Buddha's response, this is where all the debate goes. It's a little bit different in each text, but it kind of always lands without an enthusiastic yes and with a pretty evasive not really. He says, more or less, depending on the Vinaya edition that you look at, it would be better if you don't ask me this question. Which doesn't mean anything. So she asks the second time. It's like when you offer dal bhat, right? So it's the second offer. And he says, it would be better if you didn't ask me this question. So now you can 3. So here comes the third. She asks again, can women join the order? And again, he said, I prefer if you don't ask me this question. 3 times. It's finished. That's it. Okay, it's not really it, but that's it. That is a really big moment in Buddhist women's history, is that when women approached them and asked, can we join? Now, remember, I told you earlier, the monks say, oh, I heard you're awakened. Can I sit with you? He says, come. When the women arrived, he says, I'd rather you didn't ask me this question. It's a nowhere question, a nowhere answer, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's not a yes. It's not a no. It's not a maybe later. It's just this evasive, unclear response that people have been arguing about for 2,000 years. What did he mean when he said that? Why did he say that? And if he's an awakened being, why would he treat women so differently? He leaves and he walks to the next town because, as you know, the Buddha was nomadic and would go from town to town wherever he would be hosted. So he goes to the next town, which is Vaishali, and he settles there with his monks. The women have nowhere to go. Now, if you know anything about the laws of renunciation, traditionally in India, A renunciant, once you make the choice to renounce, if you look at the renunciant, the Upanishadic texts that are associated with renunciation, they will tell you that once you make the vow to leave home, you don't turn around and go back home the second it gets hard. They're actually quite strict about it. So these texts go all the way till the Middle Ages, but they will say things like, one of the best lines is, if you renounce and then you give up your renunciation, you will be reborn as a worm in rotting fish for 60,000 lifetimes. Now, that's a medieval text, but it gives you a sense of the seriousness with which people took renunciation. That when you make a choice like this, it is not a flippant, I'll see if it goes okay. When you make a choice like this, you're serious. These women left home. They made that choice. And the irony, of course, is that they're asking for a life of what is often translated as religious homelessness, right? That they're giving up material comfort. But it doesn't mean that they want to be stranded alone. They're looking for a different refuge, to use Buddhist language. They're looking for a place to hold them so that they can practice. They don't want to just be sitting in the forest all by themselves. They want a teacher. They want an institution. They want a place that will help them achieve what they're trying to achieve. The concept of awakening is not an easy thing. Right? The Buddha can do it on his own, and that's what makes him the Buddha. But the way the tradition understands things is, for the rest of us, this is something that requires tremendous training and practice and knowledge. You can't just sit in the middle of the forest and hope something works out for you. So these women were asking for refuge, and he did not give it. And he must have known they can't go back home. So he left them in a kind of limbo that's really quite difficult. And the more you understand the tradition, the more you realize how weighty his lack of an answer is. He left them homeless. Why? You have a question? Yeah.
And I feel really not. Could it be that like that?
It's a great idea. So she said her question, for those of you who didn't hear it, is, she says maybe he thought women should achieve awakening separately with their own teacher and their own tradition. That maybe that's what he was thinking. But it would have been nice if he'd explained that. But it's a great possibility. So I'll tell you a bit more of the story, and then you'll see what we do with it. So he goes off to Vaishali, or Vaishali, however you pronounce it now. And the women are kind of stuck there. They're homeless. They can't go back home. They're not invited to go with him. He said no 3 times. That's usually the end of the train. So now, does anybody know what he does? Or she does, Mahapajapati? You know? Not yet. It's coming. So she does something that doesn't often get articulated this way, but I think should be articulated this way, is she goes for a 4th question. So, we got to the end of the Dalbad after 3, but she's going for number 4, which goes against the tradition. What she does, which we don't recognize enough and we don't give enough attention to, is she just picks up and follows him to Vaishali. And she asks again, which technically means she's asked a 4th time. So she's already broken the glass ceiling here. She's already done something. She's done something radical by asking the 1st time. But now she's doing something radical by asking a 4th time. Yeah.
And isn't it on top of it that they are shaved and put on the rocks?
I'm getting there. Yes. She knows the story. Okay. So she arrives. So this is the trick. Okay. So what she just put her finger on, this is a great moment. But you have to read your text carefully to catch these moments, right? So the more study you do, the more you find gems, which is exactly where we're in an institution of learning. This is where I'm supposed to say those things. She follows him. She goes number 4. She goes to Vaishali, where he's staying. Now, this is one of my favorite things. This may be in my head. I'm not sure if this is totally in my head or if it's in the text, but they're all in a compound, a monastic compound that was gifted by a king. So they're all living in Vaishali very nicely. They're hanging out in their monastery. The women arrive. If we're going to take the text seriously, 500 women, or imagine. Okay, so we're in a monastery right now. Imagine 500 women show up at the gates of this monastery. and they don't say a word. It's the best move ever. They just stand there. You know, the death stare that your mother can do? There's 500 of them. So these 500 women are standing at the gates, waiting for the men to notice they've arrived. And the only one who notices is Ananda. Now, if you don't know Buddhist hagiography and the characters of the early Buddhist story, you have to get to know Ananda because he is one of the most delightful characters that ever happened. He takes care, so he's the Buddha's primary attendant, right? So the Buddha and Rinpoches have this, right? Is that you'll have an attendant who takes care of you, make sure that you're fed, make sure that you drank, make sure that you can get to sleep. He also makes sure that not too many people bother the Buddha every day. So he's always fielding the lineup of who wants to ask him questions, right? Ananda is so devoted to the Buddha. He won't go to sleep until he knows the Buddha's asleep. And then he will circumambulate the Buddha's house over and over again to make sure he hears him sleeping, to make sure he's really at rest. Only then will Ananda go to sleep, right? He's so concerned with the Buddha, even though he spends more time with the Buddha than anyone else, he never achieves awakening. Everyone else around the Buddha achieves awakening except for poor Ananda, because he's so busy worrying that he doesn't actually learn non-attachment. He's so attached to the Buddha. It just doesn't work for him. And so the Buddha dies and poor Ananda is a mess and he's sobbing on the floor. All the other monks are perfectly fine. And Ananda is just sobbing hysterically. He figures it out later. But while the Buddha's alive, Ananda is just the most devoted, attached monk. And you have to love him. You have no choice. You have to love him. So Ananda, of course, all the other monks are busy meditating, and Ananda is the only one who sees the women. So also nuns in the Buddhist tradition love Ananda. He's the only one who sees them. So he leaves the monastery. He goes to the gate downstairs where we are, and he opens the door and he says, "What are you doing here?" And then the text tells us in the Vinaya that has this line, and that's the line that Julia was just pointing at. It says that he sees the women are in dust-covered clothes, robes. So they're wearing robes now. What kind of robes, I don't know, but we can be evasive about that. Anything could be a robe. Fine. Robes. Tear-stained faces. Okay, they're emotional. They're women. Sorry. Tear-stained faces. And now here's the kicker. And shaved heads. When did they shave their heads? Because when they were in the bamboo grove the first time and they spoke to the Buddha and they asked, the text doesn't tell us that they have shaved heads. It doesn't describe their appearance at all. So maybe they had shaved heads back then, but it doesn't say it. And now when they follow him and we have this gap of time where we don't know what happened, they have shaved heads. Did he say, is it possible that the Buddha told his stepmother, don't ask me this question, left her in a lurch, walked away, and then she shaved her head in defiance? Because she didn't have a shaved head there, and now she has a shaved head here. What happened in between? Now, we don't know, but that's when you become a writer and you can have some fun. The text doesn't tell us. But she has a shaved head here. The women come with shaved heads. My students want to ask questions. See how comfortable they are with me? Yeah.
It's 500 women that have their heads shaved, right?
It says shaved heads. We don't know if all of them are shaved, but certainly multiple, but she has a shaved head. Yeah.
Could it be that because the Buddha said come to them and then they shaved their heads, that they were trying to remove that, the women were trying to remove that divide and be we're exactly the same. We've put on the robes, we've shaved our heads. There's no difference.
Yes, but then, so here's the problem. If the women shave their heads after he gave an evasive answer, then you have the first Buddhist women who are icons in the tradition, who are sacred persons to the tradition. I hope that's not my phone. Defying the Buddha. Religiously, that's complicated. Because if you have the most important women who have statues dedicated to them who are painted on temple walls, going against the Buddha's permission, what do we do with that? So it's a really important question as to whether or not the women shaved their heads after he gave the evasive answer, or if they had arrived in the forest the first time with shaved heads. And the text will not tell us that. So we have a gray zone here to work with. Does that make sense? I'm going to just point out issues as we go, and then you have to figure out what you do with all of this. Nora wants to ask another question.
I'm sorry. But didn't the Buddha also like defy his role as prince? So like, isn't defiance like kind of a part of leading like that type of the tradition? Like, why would it be looked down upon if even the Buddha like defied his role as husband, defied his role as prince, defied his role as a friend, defied his like?
Why wouldn't he just support the women?
All of that is defiance. So maybe he wanted them to defy.
Oh, because
that's what led him to enlightenment.
So you're saying we should all be defiant? That's the reading of the story?
Perhaps.
It's going to get you into a lot of trouble. Did you have a question back there? Yeah.
Widowed, right?
Sorry?
You said that the women are widowed.
Some of the women in the collection. So Mahapajapati and Yasodhara, because he's a renunciant.
Right. Yeah, but like mainly. So I'm just wondering what were the widowhood customs at that time. And so if the shaved head could somehow be fit.
It's a great question. So I put that in the book. There's a scene where they ask that very question that you put because to my knowledge, from what I could gather, I don't think all widows would have shaved their heads in those days. So it's a great question, but he also wouldn't have been surprised by it if that was the case, right? He would have expected her if she was coming as a widow. So I don't think that that would work as an explanation. Make sense? Those purity pollution issues with widowhood, they had existed, but they weren't strong yet, to my understanding. So we see medieval Buddhist writings where they will make a lot more about her widowhood, but even texts from 2000. So the Patachara, which is about 2000 years old, why do I want to say Yeshitsogyal? What just happened in my head? Yasodhara puts on white, but she never shaves her head when the Buddha leaves. And Mahapajapati is the same, right? So I don't think we have the head shaving yet, but it's a great question. Very smart. Okay, so they arrive. Ananda sees them. We have this problem of like, why are their heads shaved? We don't know the answer. Of course, when you write a novel, I have my answer, but you have to read it to find out. And then he says, so now this is where me, the author, and me, the scholar, got into an argument. So the Vinaya says that he speaks to the women. Mahapajapati says, we're here to ask for ordination. And Ananda says, let me go see about it. And then what happens in the text is Ananda goes to negotiate with the Buddha without the women. And so Ananda and the Buddha go into a chamber and they negotiate. And finally, the Buddha is going to say yes. And Ananda delivers the news. That's how the Vinaya works. I couldn't handle it. So I had Ananda go, he negotiates with the Buddha, but then the Buddha talks to the women directly and they have a conversation. I changed the tradition because that was too much for me, but it's in my notes. So this is where a change has happened. And this is why I made the change, because to me, the idea of finally accepting and making a huge change to the tradition of saying this is an all male tradition to suddenly this is a mixed tradition can't happen in absence. It didn't make sense to me. So I made a change in the story right there. In the Vinaya, Ananda goes and he asks the Buddha, he says the women are waiting. They're asking for ordination. The Buddha says they shouldn't ask the question. Ananda persists. And he says, well, are women capable of attaining awakening just like men? It's a really great moment in Buddhist literature. Most women Buddhists know this line. And so he says, are women capable of achieving awakening like men if they follow the discipline? And the Buddha's answer, does anybody know? What does he say? He does not say, don't ask me that question. What does he say? Unequivocally, yes, women are capable of achieving awakening. It is right there, black on white, in the earliest Vinaya. Women are capable of achieving awakening just like men. So then Ananda scratches his little bald head. And he said, well, so if that's the case, why are the women, I don't understand. Why are they out there? And he says, your stepmother, and here he makes a mistake. He says, your stepmother who raised you, why won't you give it to her? And that has created another problem for the tradition, because the Buddha is going to say yes now. But then the question becomes, does he say yes because he was guilted into it? If you say that he says yes because Ananda says, but your stepmother is waiting for you and she helped you and she took care of you, then women were ordained out of emotional manipulation. It's not a good scene for the story, and it's really problematic if you believe that he's awakened, right? This creates a lot of problems. So there's been a lot of debate right there. Why does the Buddha now say yes? And I don't have an answer for you, but he does now say yes, but on condition. And now it's going to get harder. He says women will be accepted into the order only if they accept 8 extra rules. These are known as the Garu Dharmas. They're translated as heavy. Garu means heavy. Some people have, in their apologetics, suggested, no, it's another way of translating respected. Some people say that. I don't know if that's really a good argument. But the big rules, if women accept these rules, then they can enter the order. Rule number 1. Now, you guys know that in Buddhism, everything is hierarchical, right? So if you think of seating arrangements in every monastery, it goes by seniority, right? So your level of status matters. It's not a democracy. Everyone is placed in their position based on their ordination age or whatever else. Yes? Rule number 1 is if a woman has been ordained 100 years and a man has been ordained 1 day, he is her superior. That is the first of the 8 Garu Dharmas. She will always have to bow lower to the man, even if she's been ordained 100 years and has all the training. Rule number 2 to number 8 is basically detailed versions of the same thing. So women have to confess to monks, but monks do not confess to nuns. Nuns get instruction from monks, but monks do not get instruction from nuns, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes through details of technicalities of monastic life. If women agree to these 8 Garu Dharmas, then they can have their ordination. If they do not agree, they cannot be ordained. And that's the story of the first women's ordination. They do agree. For those of you who are really interested in Buddhist life, as I'm assuming most of you are, you must know that these ordination issues are still alive, that they affect Buddhist women's communities all over the world to different degrees. So this is an issue that's not a technicality of an ancient text that's buried, and I'm just pulling out some random details, but these texts are lived texts. These stories are lived stories, and the Garu Dharmas are lived rules. And so all over the Buddhist world, different Buddhist communities have to negotiate these 8 rules and have to decide what they do with them if they have fully ordained nuns. So I wrote this story in part because I love writing stories and telling stories, but I chose to write this story because it's a really important story for the Buddhist community. And I think it says a lot about the courage of the first women who kept pushing and kept asking, even though they didn't quite get what they wanted. I think it's also a humbling story because I think it's very easy to get very idealistic about Buddhist literature. And I think Buddhist literature sometimes is really quite hard. And sometimes we're forced to push up against a wall we didn't want to see. And that is part of what we have to wrestle with if we're going to take Buddhism seriously, is we have to take the difficult part seriously, not just say, oh, Later monks wrote it. It doesn't matter. Even if later monks wrote the story, it still lived and it's still honored as part of the tradition. So we have to wrestle with it. We can't just put it under the rug and say, I don't need to deal with it. The Buddha was perfect. Okay, the Buddha was perfect, but the texts are complicated. And I think it's our responsibility as those of us who are interested in studying the tradition to actually study them. So that's why I chose to write this story. So now I've given you some material. I could say a lot more because there's a lot more to this, but I think I've talked enough and it's hot in here and some of you might be falling asleep. So to wake you guys up, questions, discussions, I'm not answering you, nor let's wait and see who else we can, if you guys have any responses to this story. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. So the first one is, do we have to situate Buddha's speeches historically, like contextualize it like in his period? And secondly, what would you think about the statement that certain kinds of religions, like say Buddhism is considered sexist, because that would be taking like a more like say second wave feminist kind of understanding? Or would you say that, oh, there has to be more context and negotiations required? Like if we look at say third wave feminist Sabah Mahmud, you might say that, oh well, then these different rules for women are kind of different disciplines for these women, the same way that a woman might submit to these disciplines, like how a pianist might submit to his training. So what would you say to this kind of mostly Western discourse about more Asian or non-Western forms of religion?
Okay, wait a minute. That just got more complicated. In your last sentence, that got more. What was your first question again?
Do we have to situate
okay.
Buddha's words historically?
Okay, so they're connected. I think we have to do all of it, to be perfectly frank. I think we have to think about Buddhism as a historical tradition. What could have been happening in this time and place for this text to write the story as it did? I think those are questions we have to ask. I think we have to ask about the historicity of these texts. So the Vinaya texts probably were not written during the time of the Buddha and they came centuries later. That matters as well. I think we have to raise feminist questions. And I don't think that's just a Western response to an Asian tradition. I think that's a very limiting way to understand it. I think Mahapajapati was asking her own questions. Westerners are not the first ones or the only ones to have raised feminist questions. The fact that she went to the forest and asked for herself, and then she got refused, and then she asked again, and she asked again. This tells me this is not something that started in the 1960s in New York, right? Like women have been asking questions about their inclusion forever. The first thing she does, and this is my proof to you, in the Vinaya, after she accepts the Garuda. So in the Vinaya, Ananda comes back. He says, the Buddha will let you be ordained if you accept the 8 Garudamas. He lists them for her. She says, okay, she gets ordained. All of this in absence of the Buddha, which is very strange. And then the first thing she does after she gets ordained, and you can go look at the Vinaya so you see it for yourself. She says, do me a favor. Can you go back to the Buddha and ask him if he would get rid of the first of the Garudamas? That is the first thing she does as an ordained nun. She challenges the system. And that is preserved in the Vinaya from 2000 years ago. So the idea that feminism is a Western construct, on some levels it is. On other levels, it's not at all. We're all human beings. All of us have asked questions of all kinds forever. We shape them in different ways at different times. Some questions become stronger at different times in history in different places. But to create an image that Western feminists are the first to ask questions about our rights is very, I don't think it's right. People have been asking questions forever. They will always ask questions, and our job is to ask them too. And so whatever question you have about the text, ask it until you feel like you're done. That's what I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
I recall a portion of this sutra, right? After Mahapajapati accepts some detail about how after the nun's order is created, then the sangha is prophesied not to exist as long.
Yeah, I didn't say that part.
Yeah.
You want me to say that part?
It's
That's
like
a really bad part.
realization
Yes.
of specifically what the Vinaya forms as. I just, yeah.
So his question, so there's more, obviously, there's a lot more that I could say. I feel like I've already told you enough that should create questions, but there's always more. After the Buddha gives women ordination and he gets them to agree to the Gaudharmas, there is a devastating page that I can see with my eyes right now. I'm looking at the page because that page is like seared into my brain for all eternity. I first read that page when I was a graduate student, probably around your age. And I was so upset. I went into a tailspin. I'm still upset. I still don't know what to do with that page. But after he gives the Gaudharmas, oh, I hate saying this. It's like the worst. So the Buddha says, the Dharma would have lasted 1,000 years. But because women have joined the order, it's ruined because women are like mold on a rice field. Yeah, sorry. That's it. And then he does like a few other analogies. He compares us to rust and then he compares it to like it's just the mold on the rice field that's got me. I couldn't even read past that one after a while. But there's a few more metaphors because, one is never enough in Buddhist writing. And so we're ruining the tradition. The Vinyas only address the monastic order, right? It's not supposed to be for lay people to read. So he's telling the monastic community that because we now have nuns, it's all ruined. I couldn't put that in my book, but it's in my notes. What I did do with that line, but I had to have some integrity of my own critical thinking. And what I did was I had another monk say it, which shows like how difficult it is to deal with this, is that I couldn't, because it was becoming so alive to me as a writer that I felt like I was living all these characters. And then to have the Buddha say it, I couldn't do it. So I got a bad monk that everybody hates in the tradition. He's like a terrible monk. So I got him to get really angry and for him to say it. And in my notes, I explain this line actually belongs to the Buddha, and you can find it on this page in the Vinaya. And it was interesting to come against my own limitations of what I could accept to write and where I couldn't recreate it. Like it was a really problematic moment. So that was as far as I could go with it as a writer. But it's a devastating line and I don't know what to tell you about it. But it's an important line to know because it has devastated the tradition. Yes.
Yeah. How much of the devastation or the problems theologically and even sort of in a secular way, if you're a secular scholar, is because of this projection of modern values onto Buddhism? Buddha, he's been sanitized in some way, especially historically. Once you look at it through the way Buddhism was transmitted to the West, especially, I think it's pretty clear that the Buddha was a person of his time. And it's pretty clear from the fact that, he has these ideas of the devas and then the sun and, the entire geography and everything. So for me personally, I don't see why it would be an issue if he was wrong geographically as to why he was maybe mistaken in terms of his historical moral standards, because I've always asked this question myself. What if the Buddha wasn't born in India? Mm-hmm. Then would he have been, this meditation focused, enlightenment guy, or would he have been more of a, maybe if he was born somewhere in the Middle East, then believe in God and salvation and so on. So unless you're a theological believer, if you're sort of a secular person who is interested, I don't see why that should be an issue.
Well, I think you're right. If you're a secular reader, you have a man from his time saying, I don't want women around. It's not shocking, right? He's a man of his time. The problem is that if you're going to understand him as something other than a man of his time, then you're facing a real issue. Because if you believe that he has achieved awakening, and awakening still does not see the full humanity of women, what happened? It's quite an obstacle that he couldn't overcome. So you're 100% right that we can just place him historically in his time, his place. And to go back to the question of the woman behind you, I think we're supposed to do that. We're supposed to try to understand the tradition from all angles, including historically. And so we can place it historically and say, we're fine. But if there's any inclination to imagine that awakening is possible, then what do you do with awakening that still doesn't see the full humanity of women? Or one that has worries about how he's going to be perceived by his society, right? Which may be why he's saying no. So maybe he sees women's humanity, but he doesn't want to upset the neighbors. But then what do you do with a Buddha who doesn't want to upset the neighbors, right? So I feel like there's no way we can really win this one if you want to believe that he's awakened and if these texts are sacred. So this is the impasse that we're battling. But if you secularize the whole tradition, he's just a guy of his times. Yeah.
Why would women want to follow the Buddha after he said that?
Ah.
There were women of their time also.
But they were smart women of their time, and they were asking for something. They knew and they wanted more. So one of the texts that I didn't reference that I really recommend you all go on Amazon or however it works here and buy it. I didn't see it in any of the bookstores here, which is a shame because there should be an Indian edition. There is an Indian edition. Anyway, I didn't see it anywhere. There's a really important Buddhist text that kind of contradicts everything that I've just said. And it's called the Therigatha. And it contradicts everything that I said in terms of the spirit of the tradition. So the Vinaya is very focused on monks and telling them what they need to know. And so it's addressing monks and it's telling the story. This is how you ended up with women in the backyard. So that's one kind of literature. The Therigatha is a very different kind of literature, and it also belongs to the same time period and is very different quality. If you're trying to find it, I see some of you writing it down. It's Theri, like Theri, which means elder, like an elder nun, and Gata, Gata. So it's the way of the elder nuns is what it translates as. There's a whole bunch of translations that are out on the market. It's become very popular in the last few decades. The one that I recommend if you want a really beautiful and accurate translation is the one done by Charlie Hallisey, who's from Harvard. And it's published by Murti, which is why we should have it here, but I haven't seen it. The Therigatha, there's a male equivalent. It's a book of poetry. There's a book of poems for monks and there's a book of poems for nuns. So you have the Therigatha and the Therigatha. The Therigatha is a collection of 73 poems written by about 70. There's a couple of poems that are written by the same ones. We have about 69 or 70 authors in this text. Basically, every poem is written by a different nun. We think these poems really were written by women. And if we are correct in this assessment, then we are looking at the oldest collection of women's voices in the world. We do not have its equivalent in any other tradition on earth that I know of. The best we get is a few lines attributed to Miriam in the Hebrew Bible or something like that, where she gets to speak for a minute, right? There's a couple of areas in different traditions where we hear women's voices, but this is an entire book in women's voices that we think were actually produced by women writers. We have no reason to believe they weren't. The tradition claims it, and the voices sound like women. And so to the best of our understanding, these are women writers. If we're right, it's our oldest women's voices in the world. These poems are stories of the first Buddhist nuns. So I took the stories from the Therigatha and put them into my 500 women, which I think you can do according to the tradition. It makes sense. And I explain all of this in the notes. So the characters of my book come from the Therigatha, because in the Vinaya, I just get 500 women. In the Therigatha, I get 73 characters. And each of these characters, and they have commentary. So there's also a book of commentary that elaborates on each poem. So you get a lot more than just a poem. But each poem says, and it's really quite exceptional, It will tell you the story of different women's lives and why they chose to leave and follow the Buddha. And so you have, my husband was beating me. I ran away. I joined the women, and now I'm free. Another one, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but I had the noose over my neck. And then I heard his words and I let go and I became free. Right? It's one story after another of women facing hardship. And you have all kinds of women in this book. So you have queens, so Mahapajapati and Yasodhara. You have princesses, you have courtesans, you have prostitutes, you have women escaping abusive husbands, you have women who are suicidal, you have women who are just poor and hungry and just need a place to go. You have every kind of woman in the Therigatha. And each one of them, and this is the part that's so exceptional, at the end of her poem, in one way or another says, "And I became free." Each one of them, so these are not just poems of hardship, they're also poems of accomplishment. Not one of those poems, the woman says, "I think I had a realization, but I'm not sure." Or let me check with the monks and I'll let you know if I've made progress. There's nothing like that. The women declare in their own voices, this is my hardship, this is my story. I heard the Buddha and I am free. Period. I did it. It is accomplished. It is unequivocal and unapologetic. There's nothing like it that I've ever seen. So I really recommend you read it. It is some of the most beautiful, inspiring narratives that we get in Buddhist literature. And I told you that for a reason, but now I got distracted thinking about the Therigatha and my love for it, and I forgot the question. What was the question? Oh, why did they? Yeah. So why do they still follow? The answer that I put in my book as a spoiler is, if women went off and made their own community, they would have made their own mess. That mess is part of life. And so there's a mess in the monastic community. And if they had decided not to join and created their own, they would have made a new mess. That mess is inevitable when you're in samsara. But these women figured it out anyway. But I don't have an answer for it. I just know they did. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question about your writing process. I think it's very admirable that you wrote from such a rich historical and textual tradition, but also managed to take creative liberty in changing the tradition somewhat. I wanted to ask, I've forgotten what I wanted to ask. I think I wanted to
all the time. Don't worry about it.
I think I wanted to ask whether you faced any struggles in doing that, and if you'd be willing to share some of your personal motivations behind starting the project of writing these sort of novels about this tradition, but also changing it in some way. Yeah.
Those are two huge questions.
Whichever one is better for you to answer.
Obstacles were many. I'd never written creatively before, so I jumped off a cliff. I was very, very nervous about it for a long time because scholars don't do this. So I was breaking my own glass ceiling, I guess, or my own perceived limitations, but scholars write academic books. And there's a way we do it, and there's a formula to it, and Buddhist studies in particular is very conservative. So I don't know that you know this yet about our field. Some fields are more creative, like anthropology. They have a lot of fun. Like if you want to have like a party as an academic, that's where you go. Even the scientists, because they're always hanging out together in labs, all kinds of stuff happens there. But Buddhist studies has stayed very traditional and very conservative, very patriarchal. It's still functioning a little bit like it did 30 years ago. So to do something creative in our field was actually a tremendous risk. I would have been much easier doing it in anthropology. So I was very anxious about doing what I was doing, but I just couldn't do what I was doing anymore. So I had to switch. The obstacles were tremendous. I'd never written creatively. I remember very consciously the first draft of Yasodhara that I wrote about 5 chapters. And then I called my mom and I told her, hey, I'm writing a novel. And she said, you mean with dialogue? And I went, oh, dialogue. And I was like, People talk to each other in novels. Nobody talks to people in academic writing. So I literally deleted everything I wrote. And then I went to my bookshelf and I pulled out a bunch of novels and I started looking at the dialogue to figure out what's the punctuation and how do you do it? Because I'd never done it before. So I had to teach myself how to do this. So it was writing the Yasodhara book took a long time because I was in this constant process of revising until I could get the voice and I could figure stuff out. And I took a lot of advice from a lot of people. My colleague in the back, who's very quietly, silently sitting there, she's heard me say all these things before. She read everything I wrote in multiple drafts, and I needed that, and I needed help from a lot of friends to help me figure out how to do this. So I would, if you do think about doing it, get all the support and all the advice. Like, don't be arrogant about any of it. Just humbly go help until you figure out how to do it. The other obstacles was getting published. I was rejected 26 times. I could make wallpaper 26 times, but I'm very stubborn. So eventually it worked. But, and then I got a second edition, which was very nice. But it was hard to break the mold because my network was academic. I don't have a network in the literary world. I don't know people. Like, it's a whole other network. So it took a long time to figure out how that game works, and it's a game, and how to understand it and how to get myself published. It took a lot. It's a very long process, and it was a lot of learning. Now it's much easier because now I know what I'm doing and I have a network. But I'm really glad I stuck it out. So I would recommend it if it's something that you want to do. Yes.
I don't know if I have a question more than just like I wonder. I find it interesting. Here we go. I find it interesting. I find that it was more clear when I was reading James' text at some point that it was that reincarnation established a kind of ability for women to not be viewed in their immediate lifetime, and for their existence to be temporal. So to accumulate better karma, you become a man, and thus from the establishment of becoming a man, you can achieve nirvana, because the material existence of being a man just allowed for it. And thus reincarnation was a somewhat of a political tool that established these hierarchies without being able to be challenged, because if that is true, then it kind of does establish some ability for women to be viewed as a soul that could traverse to better situation. So equal, yet kind of in this material circumstance of lesser ability. And I kind of see that I think I've read some similar kind of opinion in Buddhist literature at some point. And I wonder what it I don't know. I guess I don't have much of a question. I just think that's there's interesting political implications with the idea of reincarnation, and how women in their material existence in this life can be viewed in this equal existence in their soul, yet this inability because of that womanhood to achieve enlightenment in this lifetime. And so hierarchies can kind of develop without the same political challenges, if that makes sense.
A little bit.
Okay.
So reincarnation is an old story in South Asian literature. So we see it in very old, pre-Buddhistic ideas. So it's not a kind of political tool that I think Buddhism developed. I think it's been there for a very long time. You will find, I've been told to my face that I should pray to be reborn as a man in my next life, and also not to be reborn in Canada, because that was unfortunate. So you do get this narrative. You do get people that will tout it. You do have texts that do talk about that women should just pray to be reborn as a man in the next life, and then everything will be resolved. I think it's a cop-out for the tradition. Politically, all it does is keep women low, if that's what you're suggesting. I don't think it helps in any way. You also have texts, though, that challenge that worldview. So there are very famous texts in Mahayana literature where when somebody articulates that view, a goddess will come down and say, well, if you think that, all I have to do is be reborn as a man, why don't we just make you a woman right now? And they'll play with like gender shifting in early literature to play with that idea that gender and sex is a construct and that we shouldn't take it so seriously. So I think you have all kinds of conversations in Buddhist literature. It's not limited to one thing, right? You do have that conversation and you have lots of other conversations, and we should study all of it, if that helps you at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear what you thought.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to say thank you, first of all, for this inspiring talk. And not just inspiring talk, but your actions. I somehow see the parallel between what you do with the academic and the storytelling and what's her name? I'm
Mahapajapati.
Yeah, I'm with names,
It's
so she will forgive me.
Sure.
So I could not see like a parallel of inspiration as a woman to do that. And actually also something a little similar happened to me when I studied a lot. And then for many years, I just couldn't study anymore. The academics, they were dry for my mind, and some children's stories started to arrive. So I'm in the first baby steps of that. But, and I think that if I may say so, our world need so many bridges in so many and hello, yeah, it says it's on, but it's kind of maybe from humidity, it's down. So I think that our world is in a desperate need for bridges between cultures, and academic world is a culture, and many times the academic is somewhere high in the Olympus, and it's not coming down, it's not being translated enough into into lay people, whatever. And that is something that as a humanity, something we should discuss and talk about. And so I see you as a brave pioneer, and also just manifesting the creative mind of a woman. But it's not just a woman also, it's also a man. For me, it's not personally, but really for a woman, because we're talking about women. So thank you for that. And if I'm not asking questions, I'm just sharing a discussion. And then there was another thing that, if I may share, that came up to mind when you talked about her asking all those questions, breaking the rules and arguing with the Buddha. And it reminded me of Moses. Because Moses, when he stands on Mount Sinai, he's actually arguing with God.
That's right.
So God is like the Buddha, is like this perfect concept, right? But later they say there was nobody like this because he was arguing with God because God didn't make sense to him. So that kind of came to mind, and in a way, it's just so Moses and the mother and you and maybe other people is just examples of a free mind, a free thought. And this free mind is actually allowing us as a humanity to make the next step, to evolve. So I just wanted to share that and say again, thank you. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
We have one question online. So I'm going to
Online?
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot that.
Do we know if Yasodhara was also amongst the women who shaved their hair? Was she consistently with Gautami when they was approaching the Buddha?
So that's a great question. She was there, but we don't get that much about her in that time period. So she has, now I'm trying to remember which one's which, but she has poetry in the Apadana. So the Apadana is another body of literature that we have, but it's later than the Therigatha. We have Apadana literature for the nuns and for the monks, and these are later poems, and they're much more elaborate than the Therigatha. And there we see her very prominent, and she becomes a great teacher, and she leads, I think, something like 500 nuns as a teacher. So the tradition does place her there. But what's interesting is that she's a very prominent character in the early story of the Buddha's life. And then she gets a bit quiet around this story, and it's much more focused on Mahapajapati. And I've always wondered if my psychological analysis of this has always been that it must have been complicated for the monastic community to have the wife in any prominent way in the founding of the order, because then it's like you have a husband and a wife team. So instead of doing that, we have the Buddha and we have his mother, which is also different from Christianity, right? We have God and we have the mother. It's a less psychologically disorienting experience than having what could be a couple. So she kind of goes underground for a bit, and then we find her again later, if that helps to answer the question.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one last question today.
He hasn't asked the question yet. We can maybe go there.
Thank you. So just to ask for some more contextualization, this paraphrasing by the Buddha that is controversial.
Yes.
Is this like a singular example of this, or do we have more examples that can be interpreted as controversial in other contexts? Because when we think about this now, it's like, at least my mind goes very much in that direction. But
it's a great question.
If this was not so unusual, it could be interpreted as less controversial, even a teaching in some way.
So there's a lot of places that open up questions in the literature. I think it's a great question to ask and a great way to approach this. We have so many areas where either it looks like the Buddha has made a mistake or he's made a decision that we think, why would he do that? Like not letting Upali become one of the reciters of the Vinaya. So after he dies, he appoints, before he dies, people to recite the tradition. And the early monks refused to let Upali be one of the ones who memorizes the tradition. He was low caste. So we have another question there. We have decisions he's made, like, I've always thought this was a funny story, but maybe it's not funny, where he gives the monks teachings on the dissolution of the body, and then he goes on retreat. And the monks get so depressed they kill themselves. So then he comes back from his retreat and he finds the sanghas half empty. And he says, what happened? And they said, well, they got depressed. You gave them teaching and then they killed themselves. So that looks like a strategic mistake, right? And so then he explains how to do it better. But it's an interesting story of him making a decision that doesn't work out for him, right? So we have a lot of different places in the literature where the Buddha acts in ways or says things that we're not quite sure what to do with. You can always interpret these in the best possible circumstances as a teaching. But I think if you have a critical spirit, there's a question there to be raised. And I think that's the same with this moment here. Now, do you want to put him as an ordinary man of his times that made mistakes? Fine. But he's a Buddha. That's where the tradition bumps into itself. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think we have many examples. This is just one of them.
Maybe just add to that. One of the examples being when he describes the future or the past Buddhas and then what they have to go through. And he always talks about how the mother and father of the Buddha have to be of a pure bloodline, let's say up to the 7th generation, and about the caste they're born as. So it's always either a Brahmin or a Kshatriya. And so I think this is in the Digha Nikaya. It's in the sutras themselves. So it's not even like a later. So I think we have plenty of examples like that, especially with caste also. It's not.
Caste is there.
Yeah, yeah.
We have a tradition now of saying the Buddha was anti-caste, but that's a bit of a simplistic way of describing his relationship to caste, right? Caste is all over the tradition. Most of the people that become monks and nuns are high caste. So he does let in some low caste, but his community was high caste. Those were the people he knew. Those are the people that approached him. So I don't think we can completely divorce all of these social issues from him as a character, but then we have a tradition that idealizes him. And so that's the obstacle that Buddhism is having to face, right? Which is not so different from God traditions, where people have a God character that they believe is perfect, but then God does things in the Bible and you're like, well, how does that work together? How do you have a God who then makes these kinds of decisions, right? This is a very familiar question, right? I keep thinking about, I don't know if it's because of your comment, but I also had a conversation with a monastic friend of mine this morning, and we ended up talking about Christianity. It was an interesting conversation, but we ended up talking about that moment where Jesus is on the cross and he says, forgive them for they do not know what they're doing, right? They know not what they do. There's something in that also here of just, there's this obstacle, right? Like when Jesus is dying and he thinks they didn't understand. So there's a question there too, like, what are we missing that we don't understand? That's a question that I sit with as well, right? Like that you have this idea of perfection and then you have all of this flawed messiness in our texts. How do we put it together? I don't know. Maybe we're supposed to keep it messy and that's how we stay humble. Maybe we don't understand something. I don't know. But I do think, and this is the teacher in me, is that we have to think about it. We have to think about it and we have to study it and we have to take it seriously. And then maybe some realization will come. But I do think we can't just say, oh, it doesn't matter. That to me is not respecting the tradition. And I think on that note, I think it's time. And I am so honored that you stayed awake in this heat. Thank you so much. And thank you.